All right. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. So today the idea is to run through Campaign's guide. And so this is a pretty long document, and it's really designed to be read and referred back to. Maybe not read all in one go because it's pretty long. But what I wanted to do was just kind of run through it so that you have a bit of almost like commentary to, what the point of each page was and how it could be used. So there's basically a few different sections to it, the kind of which we'll go through, and then there's an appendix which has lots of resources. Some of it there's a bit which is all about the climate science, which we went through in a workshop about a week ago. Just out of interest, I know some of you were there, but have you watched any of that, or did you come to that?
Was that Monday?
Yeah, last Monday. No. Yeah, okay, all right. So you kind of know what that was anyway. So we probably won't go into that in great detail, but I might just go over it briefly, more from the view of like if you wanted to present this to other people. So the idea in the small print here that you probably can't read from there, sort of Creative Commons license. In other words, you can use this however you want, put it out there. Well, not exactly however you want. If you are showing someone the exact same thing, the idea is not to change any of it, but you can put it in your own presentation and run with it. So yeah, and just stop me if you have any questions like on each page rather than like at the end. So yeah. Okay, so first bit is just sort of an introduction. We've covered this quite a lot in these different workshops, but ultimately it's just maybe trying to put a bit of a frame around what the vision of interdependence is. And so there's this quote I've put there, which is "Never let a good crisis go to waste," which is very much within that mindset of of this idea of like the obstacle is the way. Maybe actually this does create an opportunity to change things, maybe even change things for the better. I mean, that's maybe an extremely optimistic view, but I've put it in there anyway. Yeah, I mean, there's various different people over the years that have said that, anyway. So I guess that just looking at these diagrams here, so we've got this idea that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maybe some of you have seen the one where Wi-Fi has been added on the bottom. But warmth, food, shelter, pretty fundamental basic needs. Community, I think, is something that has almost been eroded quite significantly in our Western societies, but actually, is the thing that makes people happy and kind of enables us to be functioning human beings. And then finally, this bit at the top of the pyramid, purpose. And I think there's been lots of conversations we've had over the last few weeks about really what drives people. But actually, if we could sort of have all of these needs met, maybe we'd be in a good position. So that really is what the interdependence model is based on. Not specifically Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but the meeting basic fundamental human needs, community, food, energy, and the vision, the purpose, being like, okay, well, things might be falling apart a little bit, but actually maybe we can turn that around, and using perhaps the reason of climate change as an impetus to do that. Okay, so we've gone through this the other day, so in terms of the values, the principles. So the idea being interdependence, awareness, cultivating awareness, empowerment. So I mean, this guide is an example of that. It's very much about empowering others to do things, taking action that actually has impact, rather than things that maybe make us feel good, but don't have an impact. I've actually changed this in some of the other materials to compassion after some of the feedback. It sort of sounds like maybe that encapsulates more what we were trying to say with empathy and respect. Integrity, so honesty, transparency, accountability, and then openness to feedback. So very much with this guide, if you have any other ideas or feedback, or you spot any typos, let us know. So who's this guide for? Well, I think really it's for anyone that wants to think about climate change or climate resilience, whether that be globally or locally. So really kind of anyone. I think I know personally that for me, but also seeing others around me, there's this feeling of what can I do about this massive problem? And this isn't necessarily the definitive thing that one has to do, but it's something that people could do. And it's, yeah, so that's so it's really open to anyone. I put this quote here that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. I've mentioned this in a couple of sessions before, but my fear is that if we don't build a future with a positive vision, we could end up with a future with a very negative vision. You know, we've been here before in the 30s and obviously then the Second World War, where under intense, you know, when people are under stress and when there's a lot of fear about what's going to happen, pretty ugly things can happen and have happened. So I think for those of us that don't want that to happen, I think it's about not being complacent and assuming that it won't. Especially if you look at the rise of the far right pretty much around the world, you know, recently. And I think part of that is by offering, you know, I don't think that people are inherently drawn to that for no reason. It's because there's a lack of narrative on the other side about a positive vision. Okay, so just we've touched on this again in a couple of other sessions, but just kind of recap. So what are these terms? Interdependence community, people that are coming together to take action on climate change. The Interdependence Blueprint is really a plan for funding the rollout of local renewable energy, sustainable food production infrastructure, and that's being funded by the launch of this interdependence bond, which is a form of community climate bond that enables everyone to participate in that and help fund it. So a way of pooling our resources. And the Global Climate Change Challenge is ultimately a volunteer training and resource program to help people that want to do that and want to take action on that. And maybe that's the next slide. Come on, that. And I've put this quote here from Margaret Klein Salomon, who wrote something called the, well, she's I think one of the founders of the climate mobilization in America. She's written some quite good stuff, particularly on, well, I guess incrementalism versus radical change. And one of the things she said here is, you know, we cannot expect anyone else to save us. We must do it ourselves. And I think it's fair to say that the governments have been talking about this for 30 years. They haven't done it enough. They have done some things. It's been piecemeal. So I guess really this, you know, what we're talking about here is taking things back into our own hands and doing things, being proactive. All right, so maybe I'll just run through this quickly, just so you have an overview of what we're going through. So we've just talked about the introduction. The next bit is sort of the who, what, who, why, what, how. And then thinking, if you are building a campaign, what are the objectives? What's it all about? What's the purpose of that? And then if you are looking to create a local working group wherever you are, and this isn't specific to you know, London where we are right now, this is very much wherever you are in the world, you should probably be thinking about climate resilience. And there are probably people within your local area that would like to work with you on that if you ask them, and perhaps could use this document to help you formulate a plan. So the next section, campaign strategy and planning, is thinking, okay, well, I've got together with some people, we want to take some action, how might we go about thinking about that? Then the Interdependence Day is something that we're going to be launching this year in August, so really to raise awareness for the self-evident truth that things are connected, whether it be, you know, melting ice caps and rising temperatures here, or the fact that, you know, if we wipe out all the animals and all, there's a section on climate change. As I said, I'll just touch on that, which you can use if you're giving a presentation to your friends, your family, you know, your local community, whoever, and then some other resources in the appendix that might be useful. One thing to say is that this will always be a PDF online, and it will always get updated. So always check back to the link so that you've got the most recent version. That will be the one where any typos or new information gets added. All right. I thought I'd just put a quote here from Nelson Mandela, as he's a pretty inspirational fellow. It always seems impossible until it's done. And I think that's a good mantra for thinking about massive projects and tasks, or that can seem massive. Maybe actually they're not so massive when you break them down into more manageable pieces. Okay, so who are we? Who's behind this? So the Interdependence Agency is a not-for-profit set up in the UK, which means that it doesn't have any shares, and it was ultimately set up as a result of a paper that was submitted to the Global Challenges Foundation, and that competition was seeking proposals for how to create a more equitable, accountable, and sustainable model of governance for society that could also respond to the emerging challenges. And I guess when I think about some of the things that we're trying to do here, it's that if by some miracle we manage to stop climate change, if we have a societal model that means that we're just going to make the same mistakes over and over again, I mean, it's almost not really worth bothering. So I think part of the thinking here is if I don't know if you've watched the talk by Rupert Reed at Cambridge, where the title of his paper was "This Civilization is Finished," essentially, and we need a new one. I mean, that's kind of what he's talking about there, is that we need a new model. So this Interdependence Agency is really set up to think about how you scale such a model. Okay, so why get involved? Well, maybe this is less of a message for you, as you're sitting here already, and you already have. But I mean, this is just a little quote from the Pope. Human-induced climate change is a scientific reality, and its decisive mitigation is a moral and religious imperative for humanity. He just came out and said some more stuff on climate change very recently. I've often thought about climate change, and we could also put climate change resilience in that category, as something that is going to lead to human suffering. And if, as many religious codes teach, or just general laws of society, you don't think that human suffering is a good thing, then I think, you know, that in itself is a reason to take action. And the longer we delay taking action, most likely the more suffering we're either going to bring on ourselves or, you know, people around us. And this is, I guess, I've heard a few people over the years. So one person in particular that springs to mind in the financial community, who was one of the first people to launch a low carbon investment strategy. And he gave this presentation where it was essentially a sort of a split choice between a kind of, you know, world ravaged and a sort of a more beautiful world. And I guess what he was saying to the audience was, you know, what do you want to be able to say to your grandchildren or your children? Did you do something when you knew about it, or did you know about it and not do anything? And I think somebody like Greta is the inspiration in that, you know, she was all on her own, went and stood outside Parliament on this school strike, and lo and behold, now we have, I think last count, 2 million school striking children all around the world. So I think sometimes we don't feel like we can have a big impact, but I feel like that is a great example of somebody who did a powerful action and catalyzed a movement. Sorry? So yeah, so she so
yeah, I live in a bubble.
so she's
I don't know what that is.
she is currently the she is currently like the sort of poster child for climate change, and the reason is she essentially started striking from school and went and sat outside Parliament in Sweden with a school strike for climate poster.
Yeah.
And it kind of snowballed and got more and more media attention. And then now there are kids, it's called Fridays for Future, who are pretty much striking every Friday from school and protesting about climate change.
That's just a little bit and you get to change the world. Okay, Greta, is that Greta Thunberg?
Yeah, Thunberg. And yeah, I mean, what they're saying is there much point going to school if I have no future, which is quite sound logic, really.
Yeah.
I've just put this in there as well. I mentioned the other day, the UN, unfortunately, is very, that's probably too optimistic. But, you know, they're telling us we have 12 years. That was a year ago, so now we're on 11. Yeah, so, you know, if there is a time, the time is now. Okay, so talked about this briefly earlier, that what is this interdependence blueprint? So really, the thinking is, if we can fund and scale up a network of interdependent communities that are powered by locally produced renewable energy, that are capable of feeding themselves from locally produced sustainable food, and in doing that, you're able to create a community locally that can increase climate resilience. And if we're able to get to do that quick enough, maybe that can even provide a foundation for a more equitable societal model. Yeah, I mean, I think the rules of the game change quite significantly if you have your food and energy needs met. Maybe we wouldn't do the jobs that we do if we had a bit more freedom. Okay, so the key thing really is how do we pay for all of this? And that's where this idea of an interdependence bond came from. And the idea being that the money raised from donations that people then get in exchange, they get an interdependence bond, is really going to these three areas. So building those climate resilient communities, making sure there's a digital platform to connect them all, and then actually thinking about solutions, things that can help slow temperature rise or maybe even reverse temperature rise. We went over this the other day, so I'll just go very quickly. But the idea being, somebody makes a donation, in exchange they receive an interdependence bond. There's now a pot of money which is being managed by the Interdependence Treasury, also a not-for-profit set up exclusively to do that. And the idea being that that money then receives co-investment from institutional investors to make the whole thing go faster, and is then used to invest in local sustainable energy, food. And then the people that have got those bonds can then use them to buy food or energy in bonds from this infrastructure that they help to pay for and build. So it's not the diagram earlier, most of the money, so the idea being 80% of the money is going into real world physical infrastructure. That will be 50% for the first 10 million, just as there are startup costs that have to be met. And the rest of that money, that 20%, is going into essentially climate solutions, training next generation of entrepreneurs, funding programs like this, and the technology platform. All right, so just briefly then on the climate change challenge and how the idea of how this is supposed to work. So we're in that first bit, this sort of training phase of trying to resource people with as much what I hope is useful content. And then for people don't have to follow this program specifically, they can be involved on a more ad hoc basis. But the idea is to then be thinking after that initial training phase about a local campaign in your local area to increase climate resilience. And if we have more and more people doing that around the world, we increase climate resilience kind of everywhere. For this program, as we're starting, it's likely that people will be working more with the central coordinating team in sort of global working groups. But the idea going forward, and where there will always be space, if you like, is at the local level to work on campaigns and community building where you live. And so that diagram there is designed to sort of try to represent the idea that the Interdependence Agency coordinating team kind of sits at the middle, and its role is to resource participants and help connect the dots between these different groups. And if, for example, in a local group, you do something and it works really well, it's really helpful if everyone else can learn from that, so that we can, I think one of the things that, particularly in the sort of the startup world, often you have to make mistakes to learn. If we can shorten our learning cycle, then that helps scale faster. Equally, if things go wrong, also helpful to share that information. and just to generally amplify the kind of message of the whole thing. All right, so this is the kind of what is climate change resilience, and what is it that we're actually trying to achieve with all of this. So I put this this quote in here. I tried to find some inspirational quotes to sort of pick us up when we're doing this potentially quite heavy work. The purpose of life is not to be happy; it is to be useful, to be honourable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference, that you have lived and lived well. And I guess the point of putting this here is to say that, you know, we don't really know what's going to happen, but maybe it's not so much about the destination and it's more about the journey. So what does a rapidly changing climate mean? So as I say, we went through, I urge you to watch the climate science workshop, it should be online very soon. But climate change has been described as a threat multiplier. So something that is likely to increase existing stresses and make existing problems worse, and then create some of its own problems. So what I've tried to do is put three particularly, I guess, serious issues here that just to sort of help us think about what a rapidly changing climate might mean. So we kind of go through them one by one. So biodiversity collapse, which in simple terms is either, you know, animals, plants, insects, all of nature essentially collapsing or dying. And although in our Western city life we may be so divorced from the animals and you know, vegetables, but actually that's where all our food comes from. And therefore the implication of that is potential food shortages. Last year, we had a very, very hot summer. Many vegetable crops in Europe were down by about 20%. Now, I don't know what exactly the threshold of decline in productivity is required to lead to food shortages, but we are a species that is you know, we're kind of much of our diet in the West is based on grains, which are also coming from, you know, typically quite concentrated areas in the world, and also from rain. And if rain is going to be disrupted by climate change, you know, that is a major worry. So I guess, yeah, the simplest thing to say here is basically food. Food is something that we need to think about. And so there are, if we're thinking about how do we mitigate for that and increase our resilience, agroecology, plant-based diet, locally produced food. There are quite a few examples of actually going to be showing so somebody has very kindly offered to make us a video about permaculture, but thinking about essentially, you know, more sustainable ways of growing food. And actually in the Second World War, for example, in this country, there was a sort of campaign around what were known as victory gardens. So, you know, individual people in their homes starting to grow vegetables. And it might well be that actually that's the kind of thing that is where we might want to start a particular campaign. It's something that's very tangible, enables people to save money, and it's also something that actually has been shown to like reduce stress and make people happier, like getting involved in nature and growing things. So the next one then, energy supply disruption. Yeah, I guess there's many reasons why that could happen. And I mean, just sort of an example would be that if we're experiencing more extreme weather, then in the summer, that's more air conditioning. In the winter, it's more heating. Unfortunately, both of those things are creating more climate change. But typically so there's a phenomenon that if a country is particularly, let's say, stressed in terms of it can't meet its own energy or food needs, it will most likely keep those resources for itself. I mean, depends exactly on all the dynamics. Sometimes maybe they'll still be sold on the international market if the government can make more money. But in our nation state society, countries really exist to protect their own people. So it's relying on faraway lands to provide you with energy is maybe not the most sensible strategy, which is another reason why actually producing energy locally is a way to increase energy security. One thing to note here is that if we were to have issues with energy systems, pretty much all of our water relies on electricity to pump it around. So, thinking, okay, well, what does happen if the lights go off? I think there's the difference between having a plan in some of these situations and not having a plan is going to be quite a big gulf. So things like collecting water, storing it, could be a good idea. But yeah, the main point here being that producing energy locally that isn't relying on others, it could be a good idea. Okay, so just the third one here is thinking about political instability. And that can come from a lot of different places, but typically throughout human history, when one group of people have had food and another group of people have not had food, there's a fight. But there are also other issues, like, for example, we saw after the civil war in Syria, which, by the way, has been attributed, at least one of the factors there was it just experienced one of the worst droughts in, I believe, about 100 years. So, potentially climate change linked, but I think we had about 2 million, maybe probably a bit more by now, migrants coming into, refugees coming into Europe, and that has caused all kinds of political instability across Europe. And I would guess my point would be that's just the start, really. There's going to be a lot more people that are going to be displaced as a result of climate change. The numbers that you see from the UN vary massively, but if you think about it, pretty much the center of the Earth is going to become pretty much uninhabitable. And so where those people, at some point, it makes more sense to leave than it does to stay. And I think we would all do that if we were in that situation. And there is definitely a tendency when we're under those kind of stresses to move towards othering and dehumanizing those people. I mean, all we have to do is look at some of the posters that were put up and look back to, for example, what happened during the Second World War. At that time it was the Jews, but easily it could be pretty much anyone that somebody wants to scapegoat. So I guess the point here is offering an alternative narrative and vision, I think, that is still meeting people's basic needs, and maybe is even better, I think, is the best way to counter that. There's telling people that they're wrong, and then there's showing people something better. So those are some of the things that climate change may induce, but there are certainly others. I don't know if we want to go into more of them right now, but yeah, maybe those are some of the main ones. Does anyone want to ask anything about that, or any comments or questions?
Well, yeah, the guy that came and he talked about the military being really aware of that political instability, that really kind of like made me go, okay, they know what they're talking about. They see some real security potential. One thing my mate was saying to me was, I know this is weird, but it's like, what if, a country just chugging the coal and all this other stuff, like there might be war even by one country saying stop, and they're like, no, and you're like, yeah, stop.
Yeah.
And so there's even potential political instability there for that. So it's kind of scary in that way as well.
Yeah, no, it's a good point.
It's just a weird thing my mate said, I've never thought about it.
Yeah.
It's really quite a good example of how a lot of these disputes happen at a state level.
Yeah.
And actually, one part of this vision is to sort of undermine the authority of states that with bottom up. But it says so that people can subscribe to something that doesn't identify them based on their credit, but it just says you want more resilience in your community with no discrimination. And hopefully by doing that you undermine sort of authority of the state that we're going to get co-opted in state versus state.
Yeah. Well, and I think to add on to that, I mean, I think some of the more you kind of look into this and think about it, the more concerned that I think one can become about how able the state is going to be to deal with this. I mean, you know, if you know, yeah, exactly. I mean, they can barely tie their shoelaces anyway. Are they going to be able to fix one of the most complicated problems ever? And this is where that idea of, okay, well, rather than expecting someone else to save us, I think it's time to start thinking about what we can do ourselves, which is within our power. And some of these things actually are very much in our power and might even lead to a more positive result. All right, so we talked a bit about deep adaptation in one of the other workshops, and I think that's a really important framework to think about some of these issues, because it's not an easy thing to even think about. And so I guess I've put it here, these sort of emotional resilience and practical resilience. And I think it's the emotional resilience, I think, is just as important as the physical one, because if we're not able to healthily engage with this topic, that's likely to be manifested in whatever we end up doing. And maybe just on that last point as well, I think there's that difference between acting from a point of acute stress and fear versus the opposite of that is always very different. So I think in terms of emotional resilience, are we part of a strong community? And if we're not right now, and I think probably many of us feel like we're not, maybe this is an opportunity to build one. I mean, even I think we're starting to do that now. And although maybe we don't have I guess there's also that thing of you've got maybe local communities, physical communities, and then also perhaps more digital or more dispersed. Both of those would be the ideal. Are we aware of the challenges that may lie ahead? I think that idea that if something is a massive surprise and just kind of comes out of nowhere, I feel like that's always probably harder to deal with than just starting to be at least psychologically prepared. And are we prepared for those challenges ahead? On the practical side, are we able to meet our energy needs locally? Are we able to produce food locally? Is our infrastructure prepared for perhaps changes that we can, we can't predict with certainty, but we perhaps know thinking about water, for example, would be a good thing to start thinking about. Yeah, I'm just going to read this one quote I put here. So from Charles Darwin, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, it is the one that is most adaptable to change. And I think one thing that we do have as an advantage as humans is that we are incredibly adaptable. But we have to adapt. We have to use all this knowledge, all this computing power that we have, including being aware of our shortcomings, like knowing that we're not very good at thinking long term, knowing that we're not very good at thinking about exponential change, and using that information to actually apply ourselves, because it is survival level important. And I think there's sort of echoed perhaps by Darwin, but also some others, this idea that being able to understand one's environment and adapt to it, maybe that is how you make the next evolutionary leap. Okay, so just a few things on thinking about a campaign. So some key ingredients to success, and this is taken from some other research on the matter. So things like having low or no barriers to entry for people to participate in what you're doing in the events, making events and activities inclusive, and the ability for people to quickly see results. So I think if you tell somebody, oh, we're going to do this project and it's going to be ready in 3 years, that's not as real as we're going to build a garden tomorrow and you're going to see carrots in 3 weeks. That's tangible. I think this thing about inclusive activities and events, I think is something to be particularly mindful of. You know, it's always easier to attract people that look and speak and think like yourselves to events. So yeah, thinking who are the bridges into other communities? You know, maybe it's someone who's younger, someone who's older that can help with that. So for example, and we'll talk a bit more about these kind of things we could be doing, but you know, thinking about say 3 types of events that you could organize that would be accessible to different groups, like families with children, 20 to 40-year-olds, maybe some elderly people, and perhaps thinking, you know, what's an activity that I could do in my local community that would have results really quickly. So, you know, as I said, a community gardening project is a good example of that. So yeah, and I think this also kind of tried to be a helpful model, but thinking about difficulty versus time. So yeah, if something is not very difficult and doesn't take very long, maybe that's a good place to start and working towards those others. I'll just put this link here, which is essentially, I think, maybe at least 5 years of research gone into local community building projects, and they've tried to share all their learnings. But one of the things they say is small, fragmented, low-frequency participation will not transform neighborhoods. So, you know, thinking about the things, learning from other people and thinking about what works is sort of where these recommendations come from. All right, so here's just an example, and the idea is very much to think about this guide as a kind of stimulus for you to come up with your own ideas, and ideally to do that with people where you are. So this isn't at all what you need to do, it's just a starting point to get you thinking. So I've tried to sort of map out perhaps some different stages and thinking, you know, okay, some things don't take very much time, whereas others take more. So organizing a meeting, you know, who else might be interested, perhaps giving them the kind of information they need to make that decision. You know, you might want to do a presentation on the climate science. That's what Extinction Rebellion has been doing, for example. You know, but you might want to do something else. Organizing an event for the local community. So maybe it's a talk, maybe it's a film screening, something that gets people involved and that they can come to. You know, it doesn't have to be about climate change. It doesn't even have to have climate change in the title. Just think about what might work in your community. So thinking then, perhaps once you've got a few more people involved to help you out and join your team, thinking about an event that is building community. So, you know, whether that's a skill share, a swap shop, tree planting day. I think there are lots of examples of people doing these things already. So if there's something already happening, you know, you can always work with people. But it's thinking the longer term trajectory here is thinking about, you know, and it might take a long time, but how do we get to climate resilience eventually? But in order to do that, we need to lay the foundations to get there. So another way to do that is organizing an Interdependence Day event, which is really, you know, a good excuse to do something fun, do something that involves people, but raise awareness for this wider idea. And then going forward, it's thinking about, okay, how do we actually develop this infrastructure? Who are the people I need to talk to make that happen? Who are the influencers? Where is the space? And getting then the support from essentially the Interdependence Agency and hopefully the funding from the Interdependence Treasury to actually think about doing that. So I've just tried to sort of map this out in thinking about stages. So if you like, the first stage might be raising awareness, getting people involved. The second stage might be starting to, with those groups, build or use group meetings and activities as a way to be building more community. and thinking perhaps to the future about what might come next in terms of infrastructure planning. And then the last phase, so what you're sort of aiming for is actually to be implementing those solutions and getting the community involved. And I think the sooner you can involve people in that process and the more that they feel that they have ownership of it, the more successful it will be. But just remembering, yes, we have a very urgent problem, but some things take time. One of our directors at Independence Agency often talks about how movements can only move at the speed of trust. And so I think just bearing that in mind is quite important. All right, we're going to take a break in a minute. I'm just going to just quickly go over this. So essentially, the idea being here is sort of the objectives of people participating in this. Just to give a bit of a sort of sense of what the North Star is, what are we aiming for? So overall, the main mission here is to scale climate resilience. One way of thinking about it, we talked earlier about mass migration, lots of things going wrong. If people are able to stay where they are and have their needs met, I think that makes it less likely that you have a collapse. I think if everyone is if it's chaos and no one's needs are being met and everyone's trying to move house, that's going to be that's the kind of thing that will make a collapse more likely. So if people are able to increase resilience where they are, I think that is a better strategy for everyone and individually, locally. So helping to grow the movement, ultimately, that's the digital platform we're building is the way that we hope to achieve scale faster. And the sooner we can achieve scale, the sooner we can increase climate resilience. And that comes from people subscribing, if you like, to that vision. And then lastly, it's fundraising to pay for the development of that infrastructure. So as we mentioned before, the strategy is to crowdfund from individuals to then unlock co-funding from institutional investment. So that's kind of the top level, if you like, objectives. This top one, I think, is key, and there are many ways to do that, and I think we'll all be learning together how we do that. I don't think anyone's there are probably a few books at this point, but no one's ever really tried to do this at this scale. So it's going to be a learning exercise for everyone. All right, let's take a little break and then come back in, let's say, at 10 past 11. Sorry, yeah, 10 past 11. Oops. Julian, do you want me to pause the audio?
That's
Yeah, Julian, it's in this laptop. John, can you check if the sound okay? Maybe if you're listening online, just say if you can hear me. Yeah? Okay, great. All right. Okay, so let's move on then to thinking about if you're trying to form a local working group. I'm just going to run through that. So there's a great book called Rules for Revolutionaries, How Big Organizing Can Change Everything. And it's written by the people who were behind the Bernie Sanders campaign in the last election in America. And essentially, they managed to mobilize a massive number of volunteers, something like 100,000 volunteers just in like a few weeks. And that book has lots of really great tips and tricks, and some of them we're trying to use in this interdependence model. But I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that people are just waiting to be asked to do something big to achieve something big. And I think the fact that you're all here is evidence of that. So don't feel like people are going to, some people might say no if you ask them to get involved, but actually you'd probably be surprised about how many people would be interested in taking some action. So as I say, don't worry about reading all this text, but I think a kind of starting point is thinking about asking people if they would like to be involved, and giving them an outlet to be involved in something. Extinction Rebellion is a good example of that. They've managed to get lots and lots of people involved. And I guess the point here is everybody in this room will know at least 5 people that they could ask. So starting with people obviously is always easier. But also the more people you ask, the more people they know, and you can get more and more engagement. One of the roles that we'll be playing in this, and partly the reason for developing this digital platform, is to enable people to connect and find others where they are. So ultimately, we don't need to be involved in connecting, but that's part of the role here. When we get applications, connecting people with others. So let's just go through a kind of few steps of how we might go about doing that. So perhaps starting by making a list. Who do I know that I think could be interested? Think about people or groups with similar values to those in the project. You might find that actually there's already a group that are interested in this, and there's lots of activity happening, and sometimes it's just about looking. Maybe religious groups or those who are providing food to those who maybe don't have it. We've had lots of food banks pop up in the UK. Bit of a travesty, really, but that's the reality. There's been a massive fossil fuel divestment campaign at universities. There are lots of people already thinking about this. The Green Party, another example. Lots of members there would most likely be thinking about things like this. So then thinking, okay, well, if I've made my list, what message can I send them? So it might be that you want to get somebody else within this group to have a look at whatever you write, and just a few things to think about there is being sure to explain why it is you're asking them, and what is the specific ask. So maybe it's, I'm thinking of organizing an event to raise awareness, see who's interested. What do you think would be a good venue? But try to involve people in that process. And obviously, it sounds silly, but just making it as easy as possible for people to actually contact you if they are interested. So then thinking of places where you might be able to advertise. So it might be that there's a message board or a Facebook group or an online group. There might be other groups that have mailing lists that might be able to advertise. or you could think about, co-organizing an event with another existing group. And then posting that digitally, that's probably one of the easiest ways to reach many people. And so we have worked on a few templates that you can use, but I suggest modifying them for your own purposes, and there's a link to some examples there. I think one of the things that Extinction Rebellion have put a lot of effort into, and I think it's a kind of key success for generally these kind of movements, is thinking about, not everyone is going to have lots of time and be able to take on a lot of responsibility, and that's fine. You don't need everybody in the movement to be, dedicating lots and lots of time. So just thinking, what are the different roles that people can play depending on that availability? There's another thing in the appendix about that as well. All right, so let's imagine that you've got your group of friends perhaps to begin with, or your group of people together from your local community to work on a project. So then it's thinking, okay, well, what's the strategy, and how might you go about planning that? So if we're thinking about strategy, so here's a few questions perhaps to be asking with that group, maybe in one of your first meetings. So what are the existing networks or group that could help and be involved? What are the objectives that we want to set for the campaign? And being very mindful, just thinking back to that difficulty versus time. It might be that there are long-term objectives that are more difficult, but actually you want to start with some simpler ones, perhaps to get more people involved. And then thinking about how you're going to achieve those objectives. Obviously, that's really key. And what milestones do you need to achieve by which date in order to make those work? So if you're thinking about an event, then you need to have a venue before some particular date, or if you're having musicians play, you need to ask them before a particular date. So just making sure that you're on track for those deadlines. Okay, so then thinking about within that working group, what are the roles that people are going to play? So what roles and skills do you actually need to do whatever you've said you want to do? How are you going to find more people? Who is going to do what role? And perhaps who's going to be responsible for keeping track of progress, organizing meetings, keeping it ticking over? That's kind of the role of what we're calling a coordinator or a team leader in the sense. And then thinking, so where are we going to have our meeting each week, or if it's every 2 weeks or whatever. But I think having something regular is good. Who is going to be responsible for sending out emails, perhaps with the notes, setting the calendar reminder, thinking ahead, how are we going to give each other feedback? I think that's a really important thing. So, it's not always easy working in groups. Things are going to go wrong. People are going to do things that maybe they are not so helpful at times. Maybe people are going to do great things as well. Just, making sure we have a process for giving each other feedback. And also thinking longer term. So, it's possible that for whatever reason, people in the group might not be involved forever. So how do we ensure that whatever good work is done, that gets handed over to new people?
Maybe some ways to maybe target to solve that last question would be maybe if anyone here has gone to universities to go back to their universities and maybe ask to have a small talk just to try and get more people involved. So that way you've got a community there and they're not even all from the same place, and then they can go attack their own communities as well.
That's a great idea, yeah. I mean, I think when you're thinking about kind of making a list of people or networks that you're already part of, that's a great place to start. And anywhere where you already have a direct connection makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. And often, I mean, many grassroots movements start with students. It's yeah, perhaps we haven't been corrupted too much by the real world of work by that point. All right, so then thinking a little bit more sort of practically about how you go around actually building a strategy. And well, this is a new thing. No one's really done this before, so this is designed to kind of provide some resource to think about how you might structure things. So I think starting, once you've got a group together with planning a strategy and brainstorming, yeah, it's a great way to get people involved. It's actually quite good fun. And kind of working through that. So, yeah, maybe just a couple of points on brainstorming. You know, there are no bad ideas when you're brainstorming. It's very much the idea to just kind of throw everything out. So really trying to make sure that whoever is running that session is not like shutting down any ideas. So it's always good to sort of set a framework at the beginning, you know, and stopping people from, yeah, as I say, shutting down any ideas, even if they seem completely crazy. Sometimes that's the seed that leads to a great idea. So then perhaps once you've done your initial brainstorm of just all kinds of ideas, it's thinking a little bit more about how you start to refine those to develop a strategy for all of the core areas. And this is not a definitive list, but some areas that might be good to think about within the strategy. So what's the outreach? How are you going to meet? How are you going to get more people involved? What's the media strategy? How are you going to get more coverage, get more information out there? You know, are there any local journalists, or could even be national, that you could talk to? Social media is a great way to promote a message and get people involved. So thinking very seriously about, you know, what's the plan there? Maybe some people in the group have experience or are interested in learning more about that. Organizing events, that's a skill in its own right, and there are people that might, again, have experience doing that. Yeah, so just a couple of things to think about there. So once you've kind of got, let's say, you know, maybe brainstorm some ideas, thought about the different components, it's really about then putting that into an overarching strategy. And that's when you'll start to be thinking about what are you going to do in what order, and maybe what do you need to be thinking about now, even if it's longer term. And so this awesome versus feasible chart can be helpful for doing that. Just to kind of bring the maybe crazier ideas back down from the ceiling to what is possible. Okay, so I think one of the things to always bear in mind, particularly with any project that can seem very big and daunting, is to break it down into small tasks. Because actually when you do that, you find that all of the tasks on their own are achievable. So that's where something like Trello can be really helpful. If you haven't seen it already, we did a workshop going through that. I'll add a link in this document so that people can find it. But having a central place where everyone in the working group can go see what the tasks are, when they need to be done by, and using that as a central place to coordinate can be really helpful. And I think another thing to say is that if you're breaking down tasks that are going to be distributed within the group, just making sure that they're as specific as possible and as clear as possible. I think one thing to say is that you can never have too much communication in these situations. Always, you know, if you feel like you're saying things over and over, that's probably better than assuming people are all on the same page. Okay, so thinking then, once you've worked out all the tasks, who is going to do what role? And so we've had this good, bad, like, dislike matrix, which I'll show you in a moment. But this is also an opportunity for people to learn new skills and do things that perhaps, you know, that they're interested in doing. I think it's generally more likely to work within your group if people are playing their best roles and ideally doing things that, you know, that they like doing and that they're good at. And hopefully you have a diverse enough group that everyone can be doing one of those roles. That said, you know, with any challenging task, sometimes we have to make some sacrifices and maybe just do things, you know, that we don't particularly love doing, but it's in service of a higher purpose. Okay, so then the next one is really ensuring that everyone in the group knows what they're doing, and that really is the role of the coordinators of the group, or hopefully there's 2 people at least sharing that role. And we're going to do a workshop tomorrow actually on sustainable leadership. It's a webinar if you want to join. But I think that will hopefully be a really good session in terms of thinking about what leadership means And I would encourage everyone to think that even if you're not in a leadership role, it's actually the responsibility of everyone to be helping the group achieve its objectives, and not just sitting by the side and waiting for things to go wrong. Okay, so let's imagine then. So we've got together with our team, we've planned everything out, we've scooped up all the good ideas, we've worked out who's going to be doing what. Then you're at the point of actually beginning the work. Just to say, I think it's really important to take the time to plan so that whatever you're doing is well thought out, rather than sort of avoiding the temptation to rush in and doing things that later you think actually maybe didn't make so much sense. So that's what we're going to be doing in the first few weeks, is really focusing on the planning. Then it's once you've launched, it's really then about checking in and making sure that whatever tasks were distributed amongst the group are actually being done, and if they weren't, then who else can take those on. And then the idea being that within those local groups, we can share learnings on a regular basis across the wider network. And it might be that we found that actually universities is a great place to go and find people, or religious groups or whatever it might be. But the idea would be to be sharing that. And just last point to make on this then is also don't be afraid to change the plan. I mean, this is very much trying to take this startup mindset of constantly be looking for feedback. If you try something, like don't be afraid to if something doesn't work, that's a good data point. That doesn't work, let's try something else. Or maybe you just need to change it a little bit. We've also got a template for meeting, like to run a meeting, to have an agenda, and also to be able to take minutes. And it'd be really good if you could use that, because that means that everyone's using the same format. It's very accessible. If somebody misses a meeting, they can look at that online. And more information about all of these practices and tips and help is available in this interdependence how we work document. Again, if you see anything that you think is not clear or is missing, then just let us know. And lastly, a good tool for organizing meetings is it's free. It's called Doodle, and it enables you to say what times you're free, and rather than having a long back and forth on email. Okay, so just a couple of things on, like, if somebody is taking on the role of a coordinator or one of the leaders of a group, then there are certain responsibilities that they'd be taking on. So I'll just go through these really quickly. Coordinating meetings and chairing them, so making sure that everyone gets the opportunity to participate. Taking minutes. It might be that someone is a timekeeper, or perhaps someone's role is to make sure that we're on track and not getting distracted. And ultimately, the role really is to have that overview of the strategy, to be able to then allocate tasks to different people and make sure that nothing is being missed and that the team as a whole is on track. I guess there's this idea of the sort of I don't know what the exact phrase is, like the leadership as it's almost like a servant leadership model. So the idea that if you're in a leadership role, your job is to help everyone else achieve their role to the best of their abilities. Sometimes you might be doing tasks yourself as well as making sure the group is working. But asking people if they need help. Do they need some extra assistance? Can you put someone else in the group to work with them? And then obviously, if someone has any problems or any difficulties, making sure that they can come to you and voice those. As well as then, so the only other core role is being the liaison between that central working coordination group, which is ultimately trying to share best practice across the network. Okay, and then so in terms of a few practical things, so that would be scheduling group meetings using Google Calendar. So we talked about that briefly, but that means that when you schedule that meeting and you have everyone's email, there's a link to a Google Hangout just in the calendar. Making sure that there's a group Trello board that has all the tasks. and keeping track of those milestones, making sure that there's an opportunity for feedback, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it for that. Okay, so then here's just some thoughts on perhaps different roles within a group. So we're going to cover perhaps some more of this when we do the transition training, because they have pioneered a way of doing this, and it's a very similar project, transition towns. So thinking about local climate resilience. But it might be that, if you have 10 people in your group, actually you want to create a few subgroups that are responsible for specific areas. So you might have some people, ideally you want everyone involved in the strategy, but not everyone has to be involved if they don't want to be. So you might have a planning committee or planning group. It might be that there's some people that particularly want to work on the messaging, and that could be a subgroup. Or it might be that there's some people that are particularly good at events. So thinking sometimes about, you don't always need everyone involved in everything, and having subgroups is okay, as long as there's a kind of good communication within the group. So then in terms of more specific roles, I think it's a good idea to have somebody or multiple people who are coordinating. I think that's just sort of effective. But it may be that you actually don't want to have any leader per se, and you want to all take on responsibility or rotate it. It might be that somebody is going to be the spokesperson. So, if a journalist comes and wants to interview someone, who's going to do that role? We're going to do a pitch coaching day. So if you think that that's something for you, then, come along. Outreach, so who is going to be responsible for liaising with other groups and trying to raise awareness. So in terms of crowdfunding, it might be that there's somebody that's particularly keen on working on that. Maybe somebody has particularly interested in writing or is particularly passionate about that. So there's lots of copywriting is what we call it, things, writing text that explains what's going on, managing social media, photography, filmmaking. I think one way to amplify the message is be recording what's going on and telling the story. Often there's lots of research to do. Who are we going to approach? What information do we need? Maybe there's some reports we can read about climate resilience and what to think about. Proofreading. So I think it's always good practice if you have documents you're going to make public to have someone who didn't write them be the reader of them. Ideally a native speaker of the language. Translators, so obviously if you're working in Italy, you're going to be speaking Italian, but thinking about how, if we're doing English as the main language, how we go between different languages. And it may be that you have completely different roles you need to fill depending on the objectives of your campaign. So it's not a definitive list, just some things to think about. Yeah, and I guess, so one of the reasons for doing this Interdependence Day event is that if we can have lots of people doing things locally, but then aggregate that at a global level, that's another way of increasing and amplifying that global message. So we did a workshop on Interdependence Day events. So just very briefly, so the day we've chosen was the day when they took the first photograph of the Earth from space, which I think fits quite nicely with us kind of understanding maybe a slightly different perspective. But it's really about raising the profile, getting more people on board, and ultimately fundraising for the objectives of the project. Just very briefly, we touched on this the other day, but I'll just mention it again. So I think part of doing all these workshops, we're learning and seeing from other speakers and good practice for running meetings. So we'll be adding to this over time. But just to say, if you are doing an event, then it should definitely explain what the movement is all about. It should definitely be inclusive. It should be as easy as possible for people to participate. Goes without saying, but it should be well run, well organized. It's always really frustrating if it's a complete disaster, and that's the first impression someone gets. And it should be fun. People go to things that are fun. Yeah. All right. So this bit is, I'm just going to kind of just show you that it's there, but this is more about climate change. situation, and as I say, can be used to talk people through it. But I'll just quickly go over actually this slide. And okay, so I think it's a difficult thing to get your head around and truly confront as a topic. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling. But I think there's kind of this decision tree might be useful to sort of help people think through it. But we've kind of got the choices, if you like, of deny what's going on and ignore it, or accept what's going on and give ourselves more time to plan for that and think about what we need to do. And hopefully to lead us to actually taking action that benefits the community and can help reduce suffering. So I'm going to skip over the science stuff. All right, so this is just thinking about how we kind of scale quicker and how we might use social media to do that. So, so this is Raul, who you might have met the other day, who's the Chief Technology Officer, but ultimately an ambassador for the movement, as we all hope to be. So things like adding the fact that you're involved in this project to Facebook is an easy way to sort of tell people what you're doing and attract more interest. You can link directly to the page if you want. You can also, for example, invite people that you know to like the page. Raul also mentioned that these are sort of vanity metrics, if you like, but it does help the more people that if you see something and you see that it's being endorsed by 10,000 people versus 5, you're more likely to get involved. So that's an easy way that if we all do that, we can grow pretty quickly. So for example, on Twitter, can also be linking to the Twitter account. So you might want to say ambassador for interdependence movement and linking to that, or even retweeting if you feel like it, what's being said. On LinkedIn as well, if you're using LinkedIn, which if one of the if you want to use your involvement in this community as also a way to grow your network, which I advise doing, then you can. So if you when you write a title, you can also link to a company. So there's a company page, and it's interdependence community. Again, there's another way of raising awareness. All right, okay, so this is the last bit, which is just looking at a few resources that might be useful. So the first one is this page here has a link to all of the useful links that you might need. So we've got the How We Work document, which is kind of the central repository, just a less pretty version of this document. There's a link repository, which has a link to everything else, including all the videos that we've been doing, all the slides. We have a shared Google Drive folder. So the idea is that's where we'll be putting everything. And if you're creating a local working group or a global working group like social media, then to be recording all the minutes and everything in there, so that when someone joins, they can come in and find everything easily. So that would include, for example, the logos, the digital assets. I'm going to be putting templates of all these presentations. So if you want to give a presentation, you can just use the format. Social media copy. So for example, this is something that the social media group will be improving over time, but it's like, if you want to be describing what this is, hopefully we've already written some text that makes sense. Obviously, feel free to put it into your own language as well. Meeting agenda template, that's always really helpful just for running meetings. This project brief template, so the idea is if you're asking, if one group within this community is asking another group or person to do something, just making sure that there's like a really clear explanation of what the project is. So, this is what needs doing, this is why, it needs to be done by this time, that kind of thing. And as well, if you're trying to recruit more people, than having a template post for other volunteers to see. Some useful free tools. So I mentioned this before, but Grammarly, super useful. If you're English speaker or non-native speaker, never make a mistake in emails ever again, that's free. Trello, really useful for like a to-do list, but also sharing. Elegant is an add-on that enables you to visualize timelines. Flux is really just to save all our eyes from bright glaring screens. LastPass, particularly useful for saving passwords, particularly if let's say you've got a social media account for the team and you want to make sure that you've got somewhere that is secure. And yet another mail merge is really useful if you want to send emails, for example, to a large group. Like, let's say, I think it's up to 100 emails in a day is free. But if you have the names, the email in a Google spreadsheet, you can integrate that into Gmail and send them free with a personalized, hi Dave, we're meeting next week. And just to say again, so our default way of working is using essentially the Google Suite because it's free and they integrate well. All right, okay, I'm just going to run through a couple of these sort of charts and things that are like useful tools for, I hope they're useful, to perhaps be using as you're developing a campaign. I think this one is really good in general, just in life, just to give you a bit of background on this. So I did a kind of accelerator program for people that were trying to reform the financial system a few years ago. And they, a little bit like this, they got lots of speakers in to come and share their learnings. And this one fellow was sort of slightly older, and he had maybe built 7 businesses. And he said he'd finally realized that, what you want to be doing in life is things you're good at and things you like. And what you don't want to be doing, and why you have teams, is to make sure that other people are good at that. Obviously, it's hard to always get this perfect. But actually taking the time to think about the things that you like and are good at, or maybe are not so good at, can be helpful. And I would suggest encouraging the people in your working group to fill this in before they come to the meeting where you think about what you all want to do. And we've created a template that you can fill out, which is a Google presentation. And we've also included in there, things maybe that you want to learn. I think that's another important thing about this. We're probably all going to have to learn some new skills. We're going to adapt. And also, maybe there's some special power that you might have, something you're really good at that actually it might be worth the group knowing so that you can bring that to the table. I mentioned before this idea that, not everyone has to do everything, or not everyone has to be dedicating, 7 days a week. And so the ability to think about roles that maybe have, and where they fit on the scale, is a good way to involve more people. So it might be that at every event that you organize, somebody, and it could just be then and there, is nominated to welcome people when they come in, which I think is just a really powerful thing to do. New people, sometimes it's a bit daunting coming to new events. Maybe you want to have 2 people doing that. There are things that you can perhaps do that are more administrative based, that if you've got an office job and you've maybe got an hour every day at your computer, things like graphic design, research, that a lot easier to do remotely. And then perhaps certain things that are slightly higher up the scale, if you're actually going to be someone in the community going out and talking to people, that is going to take more time and have a higher level of responsibility. So this one is essentially useful for mapping spheres of influence within a community. So let's say that your objective is to, I don't know, maybe it's to organize a community garden, or maybe it's to organize I don't know, a picnic, or some kind of event. Whatever the event is that you're doing, it can be helpful to think, okay, so who are the most influential or powerful people that I can talk to help make that a success? And so, you might be some people perhaps less less influential, more powerful, and then thinking who is going to be supportive of what you're saying and who is perhaps going to oppose it. And ultimately, the people you want to be talking to are those who are most influential and most supportive. And that's often how you scale things, or how you grow quickly. Okay, here's a couple of things from taken from some work that Roger Hallam did, one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion. He's been organising community meetings for many years. There's quite a lot in here, so I'm just going to pull out a few. Making whatever you're doing, like if it's a meeting, a gathering, making it sound less formal and a bit more fun can be helpful, rather than we're going to meet up and talk about this very serious thing. Maybe that doesn't attract as many people. Having two to four people, perhaps, to explicitly welcome people when they come into the room. Making sure that we're kind of like doing our best to form a connection. So, asking people their name, getting them involved, perhaps introducing them to someone else that might have come, so that you're kind of making conversations happen. Another one that he talks about is if you're, for example, arranging seats in a circle, kind of as people come in, sitting them down next to each other so that they can naturally start having a conversation. And if you've managed to ask somebody, what's your name, where are you from, why did you come, perhaps you can use some of that information to say, well, Joe is also from London, maybe you guys want to chat. Another one is having some biscuits, some food, some coffee, something, something for people to do with their hands, these things as well. And he also mentions that, that's another way of kind of creating a subconscious message that this is a friendly, relaxing space. Another one that I don't know if we've been doing this so well, apologies for people that have been watching online, but trying not to start the meeting too late. So, maybe 15 minutes max, so that, people are always late, it's just kind of the reality. But making sure that it's not, and that's also more time for people to actually get to know each other and chat. So that's not such a terrible thing. But, maybe no more than 15 minutes. Otherwise, it just becomes the habit that people know they can turn up late. So another suggestion is having two people introduce the meeting. So having two voices holds the attention better, and also trying to have, let's say that, we're all quite young in this room. If we were doing an event which was more diverse age range, perhaps getting someone a little bit older, so that it's not, always just representative of a small group. Ideally, maybe it's people that don't often, or don't maybe as often get to speak. So, who might that be? He's suggesting ideally it should be women, those of a minority group. But I think ultimately what you're trying to do is convey the impression, this meeting is being run by people like me. I think there's definitely a truism that people respond better to people that are like them. So thinking about that. And just kind of making sure that, being self-deprecating in the sense of, this isn't necessarily something that is being run by experts, and it's people listening to an expert. Maybe this is my first meeting that I'm running, and just, ultimately trying to empower people. I think that's kind of the key idea here.
So it's just the spokesperson is supposed to be someone like the majority. Why is it suggested that a minority is
I guess it's more the so I think most talks that you go to, certainly in the Western world in general, might be a middle-aged white man giving a talk, and so just the opportunity to if your audience isn't reflective necessarily of that, making sure that there's a diversity that is being representative. I guess it's not a hard and fast rule. I guess it's just trying to be conscious of enabling or empowering perhaps those that don't get to speak so much, in those meetings.
I think it's also just representing the reality that we're all equivalent in this problem. Our superficial differences or great societal differences, whether they're like gender or background or class or ethnicity or whatever, are kind of mute in the face of a challenge that affects us all like pretty dramatically. And I suppose whatever response we come up with needs to be reflective of that reality, needs to be reflective of the fact that we're equally, or not necessarily equally, but we're all pretty exposed to the same problem. Yeah, I want to foster a sort of unified approach to solving it, elitist one.
Yeah, and I think another thing to so example here might be, okay, so we want everyone who's come to this evening to be able to have their say. Everyone is important and valued here, and so everyone should have time to speak. And so the idea being that it's very much, I think, particularly in these kind of working groups, that you want to be getting people involved, giving people time to speak, and involving people. A couple of things about sort of the language that we use. So not necessarily telling people what to do, but just thinking a little bit consciously about that. Anyway, I'll leave this one for you to read because it's quite a long piece. Okay, so a tactics star. So just can be helpful in terms of thinking about the kind of tactics that you're employing. So things like, just pick out a couple here. So location, what exactly are you doing and where, and thinking about the kind of implications that might have. So, suggest not using an oil headquarters for your first meeting. Message, is it understandable? Is it persuasive? What's the timing of the activities that we're doing? Is there a particular time going to maximize the effect, or perhaps minimize it because it's clashing with something else? Tone. So what's the tone of the things that you're doing, and how will people react? This was actually taken and adapted from the People and Planet Guide for which was looking at fossil fuel divestment. Actually, just one other thing. So resources. We always have limited resources and time, and I think key part of strategy is how do we maximize the time and resources we do have to achieve the most. And so just thinking, is this particular activity worth the effort and time versus the others? So again, this is just so one of the things, if you want to sort of do almost like an advanced brainstorming, sometimes there could be multiple phases. So you might have a question, everybody writes on a post-it, just anything, and then you might want to stick them onto a piece of paper along this path, and then you might want to get people to vote, perhaps with a colour, on these different ideas. It can be quite a fun process to run. And just thinking back to what I was saying about different levels of involvement, if you, so we had a talk from somebody from Make Sense at the weekend, and what they would do is run brainstorming sessions for social entrepreneurs to come and help them solve a specific question. I think if you asked almost a lot of people would probably like to come and brainstorm on something, even if they're not that involved beyond that. So I think doing a brainstorming session is always a great way to involve people, people that might not necessarily be thinking about climate change. Okay, just a couple of things, just to sort of get the brain juices flowing about what kind of things could you do. So thinking about a talk, maybe at your local pub, cafe, theatre, town hall. Maybe that can turn into a regular event. Perhaps you could invite some interesting speakers along. Maybe you can host it, or if you'd like to speak, however you want to do it. a picnic in the park for the local community. That's something that doesn't really cost anything, and it's, if it's warm where you are, it's probably going to get warm everywhere. But that's something you could do. A sporting event, that's often another kind of thing that maybe gets a slightly different demographic involved. Maybe more of an arty kind of event. So perhaps it's making something, creating something. It could be even a type of therapy. Maybe we want to draw what we are feeling about climate change. Community gardening, I think that's a nice one in that it aligns with the idea around food. There's also, I don't know if you've come across this, but this idea of guerrilla gardening. Lots of places have started just planting things in spaces you're not necessarily supposed to. Storytelling as well. So, perhaps having a space where people are invited to come and tell a story, or it could be reading a story. There are a million things that you can do, and I guess it's thinking in terms of this initiative. The first starting point is beginning to build community. I don't think you can get to the later stages without doing that. Could think about putting on a play. Maybe that's a great way to involve lots of people, maybe people that don't normally get asked. And things like a community workshop. So we're going to be creating a time banking facility within the online platform, but that's something that could also be started already. Skillshare, I think that's a great way to involve people. There's lots of people with a lot of knowledge out there, so inviting them to come and share skills. And it might be that actually we can all learn some skills that are useful in terms of this climate change context. A repair workshop, maybe even a conversation club. So, this week the theme is X, and you might have maybe you have 3 questions, and the idea is people are in groups and they discuss within the groups that question, gets everyone to speak, everyone gets to meet each other, and then perhaps you share back some of the key discussion points with the wider group. And I guess one thing just to say here is, if you're going to go to the effort of organizing these events, often people come to them because it is a way to make friends and meet people. And so making sure there's a bit of time there, either at the end or before, where people can actually hang out, make friends. So a couple of other resources, Out of the Wreckage by George Monbiot. It's almost like the handbook for what we're doing. I recommend giving that a read. He has sort of talks about the politics of belonging. I think we're very much in step with what he's saying in terms of this interdependence narrative, but it has a very helpful, I've actually written it here, and you can read it, but this story, if you like, is his summation of where we're at. He's also handily thought about maybe some of the language that we might use. Language is very important. So I'm not sure how I personally feel about always talking about climate chaos or crisis. I think there's a risk that we perhaps descend into more fear, and maybe that shuts people off. Climate emergency, I think, is good because it has that kind of impetus to do something. If there's an emergency, you take action. Maybe the sort of softer one in the middle is rapidly changing climate. I feel like that kind of describes it, but maybe it's not hard enough. So
I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm just wondering, is there like evidence that creating here doesn't work? Because I know sometimes it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
In this case, it's not like it would be making out. There's
yeah. Well, so there was an article. This guy called David Wallace Wells. He's written a book about climate change impacts, and he wrote an article for the New York Times, I think last year, when will the Earth be too hot for humans? And it was the most read article ever, like 3.5 million people or something. And that was very much, telling it like it is. Yeah, I'm not saying that there's evidence, in that direction. I think it's more as people become more aware of what's happening, there is a possibility for us to be quite afraid of what's going to happen, and I think that there's a risk that results in a more negative outcome. That's what I'm saying. But I think it's really for you to decide what language you want to use.
what was the name of the guy who wrote that?
David Wallace Wells, I believe.
I got an idea that people will care more if you say this will affect humans as opposed to this is affecting the planet.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a good example. Like, in a way, I feel like this is a human problem. We'll die.
Yeah.
Like, the planet will survive.
Yeah.
The planet will be, and life will survive as well.
Yeah.
Like, it's actually a problem for us. Like, we can't kill the planet.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's been climate change was actually a term promoted by a right-wing think tank to downplay its seriousness. Global heating sounds a bit more change, but yeah, I think we need to shift the narrative from saving the planet, saving the world, to humans and extinction. So yeah, but there is also this. One of the challenges is that if you overwhelm people with something that they don't feel that they can do anything about, there is a tendency to shut off. That said, some people, and this is the Extinction Rebellion theory, 2.5% or 3% of the room, if you tell them how bad it is, will be super motivated to take action. And maybe that's the people that you need to get on board first. So, it might be that you want to do one event to begin with, which is tell everyone the climate science, and that's for those 3%, and they become, maybe the most dedicated, and maybe you want to do another event, which is just a little bit different tone, different audience, slightly different message. I think we have to try different tactics. Okay, so we talked a bit about the deep adaptation framework the other day, and maybe it's worth watching those slides as well. But I do think one thing that's, I think, a responsibility that we have, if we are, or anyone really engaging in this space, is to also be providing the kind of framework to help people, process that. So I would be directing people to that. I will add some more slides to that as well. I think, yeah, that's basically it. So does anyone else have any comments or questions, things they want to go over?
Maybe just on the fear point that you were raising, Igor. I think it's as long as the fear is allied with some kind of solution or some kind of advancement, it kind of dissipates some of the power of fear. People are slightly less it's just about fear. People might take out a not really who cares. If it's kind of allied with some sort of response or with some kind of option given to people to respond in a creative, practical way, then it can actually channel the power of that fear.
Does anyone online have any questions as well?
Just like to say, I was talking to someone recently, and she was actually looking at this a while back, and she didn't apply because she didn't think she would get accepted. So just to make it known that everyone is welcome to be a part of this.
Yeah.
That would be useful from the outset.
Absolutely, yeah. We're in the process of streamlining the ability to get people involved. I guess part of the thinking was that for this initial cohort, we wanted to just make it maybe a little bit, to have people a little bit more invested in the process. But yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that feedback. Any more comments, questions? Anyone online?
The fear thing, I'm thinking about it now. Like, if I went out in the street and I went up to people and I just said, would you like to know about things you can do to help with the climate emergency? How many people are going to say yes? And how many people, if I say, do you want to know more about how bad the climate emergency is? How many people are going to say no? Just intuitively, you can tell that. And like the empowerment principle, like if you're coming from that place, like, would you like to know more about what you could do? Because everyone feels what so if you just tell people how bad it is, they're like, what do you want me to do about it? It's like, it's just a negative. Do you know what I mean? It's a negative vibe. It's just a negative.
There's an inherent conservatism where they feel like, even if it's pretty bad now, let's still somehow attached to the reality of it. But once you're aware of facts to the extent that you realise that everything you have now is under threat, and everything you've so happily achieved is going to go out the window, with very likely to, then it's sort of, you start at zero again, and then there's a possibility there to be like, oh right, well if it's all going to shit anyway, then perhaps it is worth trying to make something new.
Their intuition is going to be like, I don't believe.
Well, at some point it will become, impossible to ignore what they see.
And also the 3.5% thing is crucial. Deciding getting 3.5% of the human population to act in order for the entire system to change.
It kind of has to get to a bigger number, but that's the starting point.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point as well. I mean, so this one of the resources recommend is a book by a guy called George Lakoff, Don't Think of an Elephant, and it's all about framing.
Yeah.
And if you frame, for example, a group of us are meeting up to talk about what we can do about increasing local resilience, is very different message. So it's, oh, there's already people doing it. I'm being invited to join it. It's what is climate resilience, or what is resilience? Maybe I need to think about that. Versus, but we're meeting up to talk about the end of the world. It's like, yeah, I think I'll pass on that one.
Yeah, I think that's like you can do something. I think, like you said, people are ready to do something. They're like, I want to do something. I don't have a clue what to do. People are pounding me when I'm doing everything wrong. And like, oh, I did this and it's bad, and I've got, I don't know, this is made of something that's bad, and it's bad, and I'm wrong, and I'm bad. And yeah, I feel like just flipping that positive. Like, fear is probably not the best route. Like, education is a great thing. These are the problems. But if you put that positive, like you can do good things, that's your main focus. People are going to, it's like the empowerment principle, that you've got. Just started to, something started to fall into my brain. It's like, okay, that's like a powerful thing.
I think that's one of the, there's some research came out recently which suggested that focusing on individual actions, like things we can do at the individual level, may actually lead to people putting less effort into kind of changing the bigger things. And I think that could be kind of what you're just saying. It's like, I mean, I feel this myself. It's like, if I know that the action I can take individually is so infinitesimal in the grand scheme of things, there's a kind of logic disconnect of how much action that's going to, or impact it's going to have. But then there's also the part that, like you say, you just feel bad about basically leaving the house and polluting, because that's what happens.
Yeah.
And that, I think, makes you shut down more. So I think, it's trying to find ways that people can actually do stuff and frame it in a positive way.
Yeah.
Could an idea be to create, using loads of what you've shown us today in previous slideshows, create like a base slideshow that anyone can go out and use for an event, so that everyone's saying the same message,
Yeah.
Has the same information that they can use to try and get people on board.
Absolutely. I think so. That's an example of something that. So one of the working groups that we want to put together is like the sort of media and messaging working group, and I think that's an example, or it can be sort of outreach, whatever bucket's in. But yeah, so I guess thinking through what all the things that we've gone over and what you think might be the key bits that you'd need. But yeah, I mean, the idea is all these slides will be available, so you can also kind of customize your own. But yeah, that's a very good idea. And it might be that it's just one really long presentation and you just, make a copy, delete the ones you don't want, create new ones.
Saying about people that do a cheat sheet of small things you start doing.
Yeah.
Saying about eating more plant-based foods, just a sheet of things people can do that they didn't realise would make such a big difference.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's sort of, once you've almost like got people in, then it's, what actions can we start taking? And actually, that might be a great way to involve the community. Like, let's think about maybe let's get some school kids locally to draw a poster of different vegetables that actually grow in the area, things like that. I guess this is almost like, just to add to that, it's like thinking about how can you devise a strategy that involves people at every level, and ideally as many people as possible, and also contributes to that kind of resilience trajectory. And that's going to be something that we'll be adding to over time. Any final thoughts? Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap that one up. So the next one is at 1 o'clock, and that one we'll be talking about community engagement, and some more tactics for how we get people involved. So it's going